All right, hello and welcome to another sales chat. My name is John Golden from Pipeliner CRM and SalesPOP Online Sales Magazine. I'm joined by my colleague Martha Neumeister, who is in Vienna, though it looks like
Hi.
she's in New York. Vienna, Austria, although she is, as I said, pretending to be in New York. And Andy Rudin is joining us from Virginia. And Andy has a successful background as a technology sales strategist marketer, and he runs his Country Domino company. How are you doing today, Andy?
Good, John. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and today's topic is what we're going to talk about is it's how to identify and manage your greatest selling risks. So if you are watching right now, or you're on Twitter, you want to join in the conversation, it's hashtag SalesChats. Martha will be looking after the live Twitter chat. So feel free to weigh in with your own questions or your own answers to the topic and get involved in the conversation. All right, so let's jump into it, Andy. Okay, so every company is operates in a unique environment, has its own unique challenges, etc. So, how can each company identify their own specific selling risks?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked the question, and it is right to characterize them as unique selling risks because it's hard to generalize across the board, although there are some things that many companies would find common. But the first way that companies should identify their selling risks is by talking about them. And that's where I see the most problems in organizations is sales cultures traditionally are very deterministic. And so they are very positive thinking. Here's our number. This is how we're going to get it. And problems tend to get swept under the rug. And so that's really the first way toward identifying selling risks is to make it safe to talk about them. It doesn't mean you have to agree with them or say, "Oh yeah, I think that's everybody's situation," but you have to open the conversation, and that means not telling people that they're making excuses and not calling out the people who bring up risks as not being a team player, but actually making the environment conducive for talking about them.
And I know we said that they're unique, but what are some of the common ones that you've seen in companies and maybe ones that people are sometimes reluctant to bring up?
Yeah, the common ones that we hear about and actually came up in a survey that I took on this are, no surprises here, the economy and competition. So those are very much on people's minds when they're in sales engagements. So what is my competitor going to do? Are they going to come out with a better product? Are they going to identify a prominent weakness that my company has? Are they going to counter my price with a lower price? And then, of course, what are the economic conditions? Is there uncertainty out there in my buyer's mind? Is that going to make them skittish or cause them to delay their purchase plans? But we look at all the scope of risks, and that's internal risks, which generally are ones you can control. Is my product ready and available? Do I have the right message? Am I communicating with my prospects the right way? Am I on the right social media platform? And the external risks, which are generally things that we can't control. That's
Right.
the economic situation, currency fluctuations, tariffs, regulatory issues, things like that. And just because you can't control them doesn't mean you can't at least recognize them and then be prepared for them. That's the key.
Yeah. So if somebody says, okay, one of the risks right now is maybe in our particular industry, the economy, it's not the market isn't doing that well, or the economy. But somebody else's, counter might be, well, that's the same for everybody, right? That's the same for all of our competitors. So how do you, what do you do in situations like that? How do you actually address issues that come up that, as I said, like maybe common to everybody? How do you address that specifically yourself as an organization?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it actually is a larger corporate issue. It has a lot to do with strategy and how you are organized for what I call risk capacity. So some companies, startups are a great example. They're not, they don't have a whole lot of financial heft, if you will. So
Mhm.
they don't have the ability to be speculative in their marketing strategy and their prospecting and so forth. They can't, they have less ability to sustain a loss of a major opportunity than, say, a larger organization. But internally, there are ways that companies can hedge their bets, so to speak. So if the economic conditions are uncertain, as you know, you can have multiple companies in the same industry, and for some reason, some can sustain those variances better than others. And the reason that they can is they've taken a better approach to which risks they take on and which risks they decide not to.
Mhm. So on that issue of which risk to select and which not to, what is the kind of process? I mean, when you work with companies, what kind of process do you go through to identify what are the risks that the company should live with and what are some of the risks that they should not take on at this point?
Yeah, that's an interesting challenge, and it's more of an art than a science, I think. The risks, when you look at your capital structure, your cost of capital, your the maturity of the market, your time in the market, you have to consider all of these things before you decide whether you're going to go out and take on what your prospect portfolio looks like. So, as an example, one of the mistakes that I see companies make from a risk capacity level is they look at large deals. They're a small organization, and they look at large deals, long sales cycle, long buying cycle, could be 12 months, could be 24 months, and it's the all eggs in one basket idea.
Mhm.
So things are great until those those opportunities may not close, and where is the cash flow? So a more intelligent way of deciding which risks you're going to take on is just the same way as you might do a stock portfolio. You'd say, well, I'll put some in the high risk, high reward category, and I'll spread it out and put some in the maybe lower reward but higher turnover, where I know
Mhm.
that I'll get a larger percent of capture. And how what mix you take on really depends on uh, what uh, what your business is. So
Mhm.
a larger organization is in a much better position to take on large sales opportunities than, say, a smaller one.
So that what you just outlined there, so that requires an element of discipline, isn't it? Because I mean, let's face it, everybody gets excited about the big deals, and it's very easy to say, well, the amount of effort I need to put into the big deals is almost the same as what I'm putting into small deals and not getting the same return. So there's an element of discipline and making choices and then having the discipline to stick with them. Because as I said, I mean, particularly with a small company, like, one large opportunity can get, everybody can get very excited and suddenly it's off on an elephant hunt, right?
That's right, and I've worked with organizations that are like that, and one in particular I can think of had a sales VP who never saw an RFP that he didn't like, and he would literally he'd put these proposals on his the desks of his sales reps, and they were an inch, 1 inch thick, 2 inches thick, and he'd say, "Here,
Sure.
go work on this." And before you know it, that person's putting half, 3/4 of their time into one opportunity, and it's great when they close. But what was absent from that analysis was, what is the likelihood that and these were large deals. They're
Mhm.
well over $1 million, but then you look at it and you say, well, what's the likelihood that it's going to close? And that analysis was not in there. So unfortunately, that's an extreme case, but at that organization there was very low sales productivity because the reps had no opportunities to work on smaller but higher probability deals.
And I guess part of managing risk, as you said, because I mean, there's committing a lot of resources, time and energy and the opportunity cost that comes into it, you really have to look at the early stage of your pipeline and really examine the opportunities and make a decision about which are the ones that you really want to, that you're going to maybe even over resource because you've got a better than average chance of closing. But you have to do that homework, but it has to happen early in the process, right? Because if it happens later, there's a lot of sunk cost in there.
That's right. You don't want to put your sales organization in the situation where you're looking at your pipeline and you're saying, well, we've got $30 million in the pipe, but we've done the analysis, the probability analysis, and we see that well over half of it is highly speculative.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a challenge in a sales organization because, as I mentioned at the outset, we think deterministically. We have a number and we're going to go get it. Don't tell me how we're not. That's the idea. And we have to shift that thinking into thinking, okay, what's the worst case scenario if things turn out basically pretty bad on any given dimension of our sales execution, whether it's inventory availability or it's service delivery or it's economic or currency, whatever. If things are bad, what's the worst case? And then at the upside, what's the best case? If we're clicking on all cylinders, what's the best that this could turn out? And then you have to look at, well, what's the most likely? And that should not be, or it's not always, the average between the two. So this takes a lot of discussion and it takes a lot of thought, and that's something that sales organizations are just starting to recognize they need to do, as opposed to, well, I don't care how you make that $100 million, but you're going to have to make it.
Yeah. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Martha has a question from one of our viewers. Martha.
Yes. If the selling risk is too high and it fails, who is accountable? Spencer Merona is asking this.
Oh, hey, Spencer. So, Andy, so who is ultimately accountable if the selling risk is too high?
Well, I think it's the organization really sets the expectation and the guidance for that. And that's a great question, and it's one that I find is frequently comes up when you talk about quota achievement, and they say, well, only 50% of sales reps are making their quota. And it's like, okay, that's half the equation, because the discussion is always oriented, these sales reps, how can they do better? My question is, well, maybe the sales rep didn't handle things properly, but maybe the quota is too high. Where did the quota come from? How was the target? How was it calculated? Is it fairy dust? Is it just a number that was pulled out of the air, or is it more empirical, based on, well, what have we produced in the past? What is our delivery capacity? What financial ability do we have as a vendor to make good on our promises? Those sorts of things should all factor into a quota. So I first look at the organization, and then look at the individual rep.
Mm-hmm. So that's a great answer. Thanks, Spencer, for the question. So getting back to what we were talking about just a moment ago, I do think that traditionally, sales organizations may not have been as aware of the knock-on risks associated with opportunities. For instance, I mean, you mentioned something interesting there. I mean, there's inventory management, right? I mean, if you predict or forecast, a bunch of product sales, and those product sales don't materialize, chances are you've probably got excess inventory and cash flow issues come from that. Or if you extend terms that are ridiculous terms out there, you've got cash flow, like collections issues. There's a lot of ancillary, factors that come into play. And I don't think sales organizations have always been very cognitive of these. Is that something that you've seen change? Because I think since the last recession, seen that, organizations are taking a much harder look at, the profitability of their sales rather than just the top line revenue generation.
Well, yes, you're exactly right, and this is one of the biggest challenges of risk management is to take the focus out of what did the sales rep do? How did the sales rep improperly handle the situation, or what could the sales rep have done better? And look at it as a larger, or not only within the organization, but external to the organization. What are the events that are occurring outside that had severe impact on the outcome of the selling opportunity? And how could we have either better anticipated the problem or the issue, or how could we have mitigated it? And that's, I think, where the opportunity is for so many sales organizations to take off the blinders, if you will, and say, okay, rep performance is always going to be an issue. There's no question. So I'm not advocating that the reps are off the hook, but it's to look more broadly and say, well, in addition to, or if we look outside the scope, how can organizations have better visibility into their situation and then understand what that means for their planning and for their execution?
And I think, it's going to go back to Spencer's point in some ways about accountability. I mean, you have to start to look at these things more holistically, as you pointed out, because if you are, if you're struggling in the marketplace, yes, there may be some culpability on behalf of the individual reps in the field, but there may be a larger amount of culpability on your strategic positioning or your pricing or your marketing or whatever, all these other elements that come into play. So is that something that you're seeing more of now, is the understanding that there is, risk is a shared responsibility as opposed to, revenue risk is a shared responsibility as opposed to just being on the sales organization's shoulder?
I think the companies that are performing best in their industries have certainly recognized that, and the ones who are struggling financially or are lagging in their sales execution are still taking what I consider a very cavalier view of it and saying, well, the reps are responsible for making goal, but if they look at their operations, the reality is a strong rep will not stay if they're not making goal. And so there's a huge risk to the organization. You can say all you want that they're not achieving quota, but it's still incumbent on the organization to think very carefully about their quotas and make sure that they're achievable, because whether they make it or not, a good rep is just simply not going to stay. They're going to go on to a competitor where they can make goal and make the kind of income that they're seeking and expecting.
And you raise an interesting point too about quota, right? Because let's face it, I mean, quota assignment in a lot of organization is not a very scientific exercise, right? It's like, hey, Andy, you delivered $1 million in revenue last year. I want you to do 1.2 million this year, right? I mean, that's often the way it's done. I mean, is there, again, is that something that you think needs to be looked at differently and looked at because often it's just a mathematical exercise, right? I mean, the company wants to make X amount of revenue, then I bump everybody's quote up by X amount, I add it all together and boom, we have the number.
Yeah, I mean, what you described is actually the state of the art in many companies, and that is, okay, John, you had a great year last year. You made 2 million. It just happens that half of that was on a one-off deal that you worked for a long time. But outside of the sales organization, back in the CFO's office, they're saying, well, if John closed 1 million, or 2 million, why can't he do 2.75 or 3 this year? That is not necessarily extensible. So that needs to be thought about. But more typically, the company makes a financial goal overall, revenue goal, and they say, well, it's 100 million and we've got 100 reps, and so we'll just divide that number. That's the easy math, but that's how many organizations do it. And they don't have regard for okay, how many new reps do we have? What's their experience? What's their territory profile like? What's their account penetration? All those factors need to be taken into consideration when you assign an individual quota. So it's not as easy as a lot of companies make it.
And what's interesting too is, I mean, a lot of companies will go through their budgeting process in sometime, August, September, October of, if you're on a fiscal calendar year, but that's typically around that time frame. Most people are putting budgets and together and all of that, but yet a lot can change between like September, October, and January, right? And the and I always find that, a lot of the times, companies find themselves in this strange situation where they put together the budget for next year and the quotas and the forecast, all that good stuff. And yet by the time they're actually acting upon it, the circumstances may have changed. So it's already out of sync. So I mean, I would certainly advocate that you need to have a more dynamic process nowadays, as opposed to the more traditional, just put the budget together and then just see how you perform against it. There needs to be a little bit more dynamism in that process, a little bit more room to adjust and tweak as you go, because I just feel that's the nature of business today. It changes so rapidly, and circumstances, even economic conditions, change rapidly.
Well, I totally agree. I think you can talk to any company in the United States now that has to deal with tariffs, and they understand that problem that you just described acutely, where their selling prices have had to be adjusted in major ways. And I don't know if they were anticipating that a year ago when they set their revenue goals. So now, how does that percolate into the sales force? Well, can they still hold them accountable for the same number, even though their selling prices now are increased by 25-30%? It has to be taken on a case by case basis.
Yeah, and I think to your point, then I think that's when the company needs to come together and say, okay, circumstances have changed, therefore we need to adjust, but we need to adjust across the board, right? Because it's not just the one person who has to or it's just not the one group who should take this on their shoulders, right? It shouldn't just be the sales organization, because suddenly their selling conditions are much harder, but they're the only ones who actually suffer financially, shall we say. Everybody else gets paid as normal.
Yeah, and I think that's really the focus of risk management, is to look at where the volatility can occur and to make every effort to cut the volatility. That's, I think, one of the misconceptions when you think about these risks, is to say, well, we're going to eliminate these kinds of problems. We're going to source from this supplier or not that, and not another supplier, but more in operation, what companies do is they say, well, we'll never get rid of volatility, but we can close the gaps, because that's really the enemy for all kinds of operational and strategic planning. Is, nobody likes to have a revenue spike in one quarter, and I mean, the revenue spikes are nice, but that they create their own set of problems. But
the spikes are nice. It's the dips that we can do without.
It's the spikes followed by the dips. They as they say, they like the level path, and so that's really what we're trying to do in risk management, is to say we want to look at where those ranges are and figure out how to close them.
Perfect. Well, listen, Andy, the time has flown by. I can't believe we're already up against the end. What we always like to do on this show is ask our guests to share what's one of your power tips. What's one of the things you do personally to set yourself up for success every day?
It's a great question. I appreciate the opportunity. I am others have advocated this, so I don't claim originality, but I do feel like lifelong learning is a key part of any kind of professional development, and I really eschew the idea of being an expert or expertise. I don't say I run paranoid every day, but I always run feeling like I need to know more than I do. So that's really what keeps me going, and happily, there's not a day that goes by that I'm not confirmed in that in that belief.
Well, I think that's a great philosophy, and I think that's one a lot of people should take on board. Is that we never know enough.
We never know enough.
And the world is changing so rapidly that we almost know less. Of course, as I always say to my now 14-year-old son, just had his birthday the other day, is like I'm too old to know everything.
That's a good way to put it, and I'm sure he agrees with you too.
Yeah, he does, because he's young enough to know everything. So there you go. It's all good.
That's right, and old enough to confirm that you're old.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
right. All right. Listen, thanks, Andy. Before you go, if you just want to tell people how to learn more about you, get in contact with you.
Sure. My company is Contrary Domino Inc., and that's the URL, contrarydomino.com. And I'm based in Virginia, right outside Washington, D.C., where it's actually snowing right now. So that's early snowfall for us. And you can get my contact information on LinkedIn as well. I'm on LinkedIn. Just look up Andy Rudin, Rudin, and look forward to talking with you.
Great. Thanks, Andy. And thank you, Martha in Vienna, Austria / New York. Good activity on the Twitter chat today?
Yeah, fine.
Very good. Good. All right. Well, listen, thanks everybody for joining us. My name is John Golan, SalesPOP Online Sales Magazine, Pipeline of CRM. See you all for another sales chat really soon. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, John. Talk soon.
Bye.
Bye.